Welcome. I'm Rob Musick. I'm the chaplain with the University of Pikeville, and today we're going to discuss navigating religious diversity, particularly in the healthcare setting. So let's begin. And I just encourage you to really reflect on your own journey, but also I want to celebrate you for leaning into something that's really important, very meaningful to both your patients, but also our healthcare providers. So let's begin this journey. Why does this matter so much to me? Well, of course you might think, well, he's the chaplain, of course it matters. Yeah, let me tell you a quick story. When I was 27 years old, my first daughter, Mariah Hope, was born, and she was born in Chennai, India. My wife and I were fairly new to the country of India, particularly to the city of Chennai, and to have our daughter there was a very nerve-wracking experience because we were away from family, we were away from everything that we knew that was comfortable, but of course we really trusted our doctor, we trusted our friends who were in the city. But yet, what about the nurses? What about the facility? And particularly, what about our strongly held religious views? Because here we had flown all the way around the world, we're studying in India, and my Christian faith was really, really important to me. And of course in India, the beautiful diversity of religion that they have in that country, but it's an overwhelmingly Hindu country, which is a beautiful part of India. Yet, would I be encountered by someone trying to push their religion? I didn't know how it operated in India, but I knew in the United States sometimes I might have a pastor or so who comes by and wants to talk to me at the hospital about important things of religion, and yet I wasn't so sure I wanted to go there. Well, let me tell you. When Mariah was born, we found out that the hospital setting really encouraged us to lean into what was important for us, particularly praying of gratitude when Mariah was born and honoring of all of our religious needs. And in that moment, I realized for the first time in my life how important it was to be received for my own religious expressions in times that it mattered so much when my religious experience or religious faith wasn't the most dominant in the land. On that day, in October of 2007, I was a recipient of gracious hospitality toward my religious identity. Turns out, it made all the difference in the world. So today, when we think about what it means to navigate religious diversity, we need to really go beyond simply allowing people to be who they are. We actually need more than that. So let me just lay down in a few slides kind of the fundamentals, the foundation of what I mean when I say navigating religious diversity. It starts with what we call appreciative inquiry, meaning having the posture of a learner. Appreciative inquiry is this idea that you are leaning in to appreciate and value the best in every person. Well, it's this idea that we believe that religious diversity is actually a strength and a gift. It's never a threat or a challenge, but it's a real gift. When people bring to the table their religious diversity, they're offering us a special gift into who they are and what matters to them. In appreciative inquiry, what we're trying to do is we're trying to value the things that are valuable to others. And let me use a little stronger language. It's not trying to, it is valuing what's important to other people because it matters to them. See, this whole foundational idea is really a great way of how we can express empathy towards others, allowing them to be who they need to be in the space. It's also a sense of appreciation, kind of saying, thank you, thanks for sharing this part of you. Wow, I deeply value what you're giving me today. And we can do this in what I'm going to call respectful questions. So let's say that you're serving a patient or you're serving a student or you're partnering with a healthcare provider and you may not know anything about their religious perspective, or you sense that maybe, like myself, maybe I come in on Ash Wednesday and I have a big black ash cross on my forehead and you kind of wonder maybe what that's about and you're not sure how to ask. Well, here's a really great way to begin the conversation. Here's the question. When I am serving you, I might say, is there anything about you or your family's practice, spiritual or religious practice, that myself or our healthcare team should know? Let me say that again. Is there anything about you or your family's spiritual or religious practice that our healthcare team should know how to best serve you? And in that moment, they may say, well, turns out, yeah, today's Ash Wednesday, and I'm not going to eat today, so please don't send me a meal tray. Maybe that's what's going on. The second foundation for navigating religious diversity is something I call gracious hospitality. I picked this up from a writer, author, Father Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen, in many of his spiritual books, talks about the gift of gracious hospitality. It's the philosophical groundwork for everything we do in religious diversity. And here's what I mean by it. It's this idea that we value and love other people because they're human and they matter. It's the idea that you honor people in a way that you give your time, you give your space, even you give your mental space to another person. I honor you, and I'm being gracious to you. I'm being a hospitable provider to you by giving you my time because you matter. It's allowing people to be who they are. It's also understanding that diversity is a gift. And also, we seek to recognize those moments when maybe I'm sharing about Ash Wednesday, and maybe inside of you, you might have a moment where you feel a little threat, or you're kind of feeling like, I don't know if I agree with that. Gracious hospitality is the sense that you look inside and you start recognizing those feelings. All of a sudden, wait, I feel a little threat. All of a sudden, I feel a little nervous when he's sharing that because I kind of wonder, is he going to make me put a big black cross on my forehead? Turns out gracious hospitality is simply recognizing what's going on inside of you, you identify it, and then you lean in to the other person across from you, and you realize, okay, I'm feeling threat, but there really isn't threat here because Rob is simply sharing about his Ash Wednesday experience. Ultimately, we lean into each other because it's a deep act of love. It's a deep act of generosity towards one another and honoring one another. Now, it turns out when we navigate religious diversity, so often we wonder about what do we do with our own sense of values or roots. And I think those are the most important things that help us navigate religious diversity. And here's what I mean by that, is that so often we get caught up in beliefs, but I really want to focus on practices today. Because so often that there are practices that myself as a Christian really recognize, identify, appreciate, and practice in the same way of many other different faith traditions. So practice is important because I don't want to lose myself in the process of serving other people because I need to be myself also in a space. So what I'm going to say is this: know your own spirituality, know your own religious values, your own religious or spiritual practices, and honor them, because the more I honor and value my own practices, I can deeply appreciate the practices and beliefs of other people. Because when I'm holding close and in love the things that I love, I no longer feel a threat because I value what I value. See, it turns out, actually, you're going to find out in this journey, and you probably already know this, that for many of us, picking and choosing from a wide variety of religious expressions is actually healthy and normal. So you say, maybe I'm a Christian and I really value when I go to church and I pray. But turns out when I have been talking with my friend who's a Muslim, and I noticed how they pray when they are praying towards Mecca and they have their face down on the ground, wow, I really value that. I think that is beautiful. I want to incorporate that in my own spiritual practice. It's very common for us to pick and to choose and to appreciate wide varieties of expressions in religion. Also, again, I want to give you another question to hang on to when you're serving other people. So maybe you're a doctor and you're sitting right across the hospital bed from a person and you want to ask them a question about their religious or spiritual values or traditions or practices. Here's a question. And as you ask them about their own values and practices, the question I would ask you to ask yourself, even before you begin that conversation, is this. How do your own religious or spiritual practices impact your views, impact the way that you practice medicine? As you reflect on yourself first, it helps you create a pathway to receive and honor other people's journeys and what's important to them. A few more key realities before we dive into the different religious expressions. Number one, we have to find out that religions are actually diverse even among themselves. So if I say something about a Buddhist, we need to be very careful because not all Buddhists are the same. Just like all other religious persons, they're not the same inside of it. Turns out in my own church, I may practice my faith one way, but a person in the pew beside me may practice it a little different. So we have to be aware that religions are diverse even within their own expressions. Second thing we need to be aware of is this idea that religious identity is not simply the only way that we can be known. Again, back to my own tradition. Yes, I am a Christian, and you can even see today that I have religious clothing on, but my identity is not just that. I'm also Appalachian. I'm also a dad. And maybe on this day, I might want to talk about my kids more than I want to talk about my religion. Also, we're going to find out that religions evolve over time. It's a natural part of the human experience. So just because I've been reading the Old Testament and I hear about Judaism from Moses, it doesn't mean my neighbor who is Jewish may practice their faith just like Moses. And finally, and this is fundamentally most important, religions are not the same. Anytime that we say, oh, well, it turns out I just see them all the same, it's actually really disvaluing to whatever religious tradition we're talking about. Because turns out religious diversity is really important. But that doesn't have to mean that there is a conflict or that there is competition or that there is threat. The idea that my friend who is a Muslim, he and I may have very different experiences or practices or even values at times. But the beautiful thing is both are good, both are beautiful, and both are helpful. So I don't want to say, hey, Christianity and Islam are the same, because that's really disvaluing to both of our traditions. So remember, religions aren't the same, diversity is important, and lean into those aspects of diversity, because turns out your life may change in a really great and beautiful way. So what do we do now as healthcare providers? Because how in the world are you supposed to understand all the different religious traditions, practices? It's hard even inside of your own religious tradition to try to figure it out. And quite frankly, when you're studying for medical school or you're out there trying to learn all the medicines and be the best healthcare provider you can be, how are you expected to be an expert also in religion? Turns out you're not. People aren't going to expect you to be the expert in the room, but you know who is? Your patient or the student that you're serving. Remember those questions that we had asked first? Is there anything about your spiritual or religious practices that I should know or that our team should know in best serving you? That is the ultimate way to lean in. Allow the patient, allow the student to define what they need. Maybe there's a particular holiday that's really important and they're going to need the day off of school from it. Or maybe it's a religious holiday where they're in the hospital and they're going to need special focus on a day like that. So ask each person. Now, you don't want to put all of the demands on the patient, but they'll tell you what is important to them. So ask in a gracious and open way. And that's really important to never assume. So maybe when you see me coming into the hospital, you might assume a certain tradition, value. You might assume certain things with me. Maybe today that you see the fact that I'm a chaplain, I have a black shirt on and a white collar, and you might say, wait, he must be a Catholic priest. Well, if you'd make that assumption, you'd be very surprised when you met my wife and my 4 children. Turns out just because it looks like it, it isn't, right? So never assume. Always be willing to ask. And also for healthcare providers, I can't say this enough. Lean into your chaplains. Chaplains are usually on every healthcare team. In a hospital setting, in a clinical setting, you're going to have a chaplain around, or a team of chaplains. And your chaplains, they are the experts in this subset of practice. So when you think about, you might want to call in to have the oncologist look at something, or you might have the call down to have a question to the pharmacist. Also, when you think about religion and spirituality, your chaplain is the expert in the room, so ask your chaplain, call. And here's the thing, a lot of people don't realize, chaplains have to go through at least 8 years of formal training to be called kind of a chaplain. So lean in, because here is a fellow equal team member on your healthcare team that can provide great help for you in moments of, you don't know, right? So ask your patients, ask your students, and ask your chaplain. I want to give special thanks today for a really important article that I would encourage you to look at. It's called Cultural Religious Competencies in Clinical Practices. And these healthcare providers and researchers have really given us a jewel. They're going to go through different religious expressions. So, are you ready? Buckle your seatbelt, because we're going to go on a religious journey and talk about various faiths and religious practices that may be really helpful for you when you're serving your patients. So now let's talk about Buddhism. Buddhism is one of the oldest religious traditions in the world. And it's interesting when we think about Buddhism, because for some of us, when we think religion, we automatically think God. And as soon as you do that, you're kind of stepping outside of the Buddhist tradition. So let's dive in and talk a little bit more about Buddhism. So Buddhism, oftentimes you're going to see one of 2 religious expressions within Buddhism. Now again, be mindful, every religion is very diverse, but I want to give you a broad look at 2 different aspects of Buddhism. The first aspect of Buddhism, and probably the one that you think about the most, is what we call Tibetan Buddhism. And of course that comes from Tibet. Tibetan Buddhism is, when you think about it in your mind, you think of the Dalai Lama, right? Tibetan Buddhism is this. It's this idea of religious practice or spiritual practice based on the teachings of the Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama, right? The Buddha. And it's this idea that personal religious insight, or personal insight into the world, to yourself, is what gives liberation. So as a person is exploring their own experiences in this world, their own insights into the world, rather than God, right, because that language would feel very artificial or nonsensical for a Buddhist, it's this idea of the law of karma, or cause and effect. Also, Buddhists are going to believe in rebirth or reincarnation as you continue your journey towards enlightenment or liberation. For a Buddhist, it's going to be really important that they do not have mind-altering drugs, no alcohol, no cigarettes. Important to have your mind clear as you are personally experiencing the world, yourself, others, as you feel connected to all things on your path. Because of that, because Buddhists strongly believe in the inner connection of all beings, from the ant to the person in the hospital bed beside them, most often Buddhists will be vegetarians, not eating meat. Now again, I put a pause there to say that there may be some that will eat meat, but a majority of Buddhists will be vegan or vegetarian. Also, within Buddhism, there isn't a sense of kind of a hierarchy of religious structure. There really isn't a sense of like the priest who's going to come in. Now, there are religious persons who have given their lives to the religious pursuit. And you may see like the saffron robe or the burgundy robe. Yet, within Buddhism, every person is an equal as they encounter and experience their own experiences. Also, we're going to find out inside of Buddhism that there really isn't any restrictions on organ donation or other types of procedures. Where Buddhism becomes important to pay attention to is when it comes to death. There are particular death rituals that are important to a majority of Buddhists. And the first thing is this: when a Buddhist is dying, it's really important for their mind to be clear. So they may have a different approach to medications because they want their mind to be clear and focused as they prepare for their own transition and death. It's really important, if you're having a terminal conversation with a Buddhist, to ask if they need a Buddhist representative, clergy, or support person to help them make the final transition, to guide their dying. You'll find out that many times that prayers, individual prayers, or chanting will become important to a Buddhist. So if you walk into the hospital bed or the hospital room and you hear your patient chanting, know that's a part of their religious tradition. And also, it's really important as a Buddhist is dying to provide as calm and peaceful an environment as possible as they're preparing to make a transition, as their body, as their mind, as their being transitions. They're getting ready for the next steps, and they want that to be peaceful and calm. Now, that is a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism. Zen Buddhism, on the other hand, which has very much some value in meditation, it's very highly personal, and also a Zen Buddhist may have a teacher or a guru that they really, really value and are learning from. Yet, Zen Buddhists oftentimes won't have anything on the outside that would distinguish them from any other person walking the street. Typically, you won't see robes, you won't see bracelets, you won't see anything that's identifiable, because Zen is an entirely, completely personal journey of self-exploration, of being present in the moment. So both your Tibetan Buddhists and your Zen Buddhists are going to highly value space and time to be able to meditate, to breathe, to be aware. Now, inside the largest religious tradition of all, Christianity, we're going to spend some time there thinking about Christianity. Now, for many of you, particularly in this country, because Christianity is the most populous or dominant religion inside the United States, you may say, okay, I feel pretty comfortable there. But I'm going to invite you to lean in for a few minutes and think about some of the distinctions that may help you really value and serve your patients, but also help you not make any missteps as you go along the road of your medical journey and as you serve people in a healthcare setting. So let's talk about Christianity. Of course, Christianity is the largest religion in the world. Over 2 billion people claim to be Christian. Christians believe in one God, and that God is expressed in 3 various ways, not 3 different gods. That's important to realize. Christianity will oftentimes use the language of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. So often that God the Son, which we know of as Jesus. Christians believe that Jesus of Nazareth is God. So in that you will see a lot of references, or hear a lot of references to Jesus, prayers to Jesus, pictures of Jesus, and the community gathers around and will pray in Jesus' name. Now, for Christians, the Bible becomes really important. That's why you may see in your hospital, your patient's hospital room, the Bible sitting on their end stand, or a person coming to read the Bible to them. And when I say the Bible, I mean what is called the Old and New Testaments. So if you go into your hospital room now, you might pull open the drawer and you might find one of those Gideon's Bibles already there ready for the patient to come in. But the Bible becomes important for a lot of Christians. Also, the image of the cross. becomes really important for Christians. You may see them wear it around their necks. You might see them wanting to display it in their hospital room. Because for Christians, the cross is the way that Jesus died, and they want to honor the idea of suffering, but also Jesus' gift for them. Also, the cross is a reminder that their life doesn't simply end in death, but there is resurrection. So for Christians, they're going to believe mostly in some kind of eternal life. So when you have a terminal conversation with a Christian, the idea of going on to meet their family members or to meet God or to go to heaven might become really important language for them and bring them a sense of peace in their journey. But also for Christians, it's really important to realize that going to church, going to Sunday or Saturday gathering becomes really important. And it's one of the complicating pieces for when a person's in a hospital or their health is beginning to decline, because they might not be able to go. So they might need the church to come to them. So they might have people who will come and pray with them, read with them, celebrate God's goodness in their midst. A few other things that would be helpful to know about Christianity. Sacraments. Sacraments are practices, communal practices that Christians participate in. And let's just think of two. The first one may be baptism. Now that is the sprinkling of water or the immersion of a person in water. Now why might that be important for a healthcare provider? Well, it turns out maybe the person who is now walking through a terminal illness may feel like they want to get their lives right with God, and that may be the time that they want to be baptized. So you may see the chaplain having a conversation with you about how can they get this patient to a body of water, or how can they have a religious experience inside of their own hospital room where they sprinkle water on the person's head. Baptism is the gateway of them feeling like their sins are washed away and they're coming in to the church or coming into this family of God. The second sacrament that we need to talk about is what's called communion or Eucharist. Now, this will vary depending on which Christian tradition we're talking about. But for many persons, receiving communion will become important, particularly in the hospital when they're not feeling well. Communion typically is a small piece of bread and a small glass of juice or wine. And for many people, for many Christians, this becomes a very important act of togetherness, identifying with Jesus' suffering, but also to identify with the communion. It's a practice that some Christians will do every Sunday when they go to church. So if they're in the hospital, this could be something that they greatly miss. Finally, within Christianity, because Christianity is what we call a converting religion, it's very common that you may have one of your patients or students who feels like it's their responsibility to share their faith with you. That may mean they invite you to church. That may mean they say that they're praying for you, or they might simply encounter you, want to give you religious materials or literature, or they may want to actually invite you to go to their church. They may even invite you for some kind of religious dedication or commitment on the spot. Now, so often we can feel like, whoa, like what are you trying to do to me? Turns out it's a deeply held value for many people inside of the Christian tradition. Now, not all branches of Christianity lean into that, but for many, that's important. So if that happens to you, notice that it's not anything individual about you. It's really about that person and how they're trying to share the most important thing of their lives with you, the role of Christianity in their life. Now, I've given you kind of a big, broad overview very quickly of Christianity, but let's dig down now and let's talk about, under that large umbrella of Christianity, let's talk about the largest subset or branch of Christianity, Roman Catholicism, better known as Catholics. Roman Catholicism is a Christian tradition that is one of the oldest or most ancient forms of the practice. And what you'll notice with Roman Catholicism is that particularly around death and dying, something becomes really important to Roman Catholics, and that is what we call the prayer for the sick, or the anointing of the sick, better known as last rites. Now that praying for the sick can only happen by a priest. Remember how I told you in Buddhism how there really isn't a religious hierarchy or structure? In Roman Catholicism, it's really the opposite. There is a very detailed hierarchy, starting with the Pope, down to cardinals, to bishops, to the local priest at the church. The priest will, of course, be a man. Women cannot be priests in this tradition. And the man will come and provide the prayers and the rituals for a person who is dying. This becomes extremely important for Catholics. And you as a healthcare provider, in any ways that you can help facilitate this and help the priest to get to your patient, you're doing them a great service, if that's what the patient wants. Also, we're going to find out as a healthcare provider that for Catholics, their cross that they will typically wear or have displayed will have Jesus of Nazareth actually on the cross. Because in Roman Catholicism, there is a real sense or value of suffering, and how suffering is a part of the journey of life. So Roman Catholics will find and place their suffering in the suffering of Jesus. And they look to Jesus and say, if Jesus suffered, I too can suffer. If Jesus suffered, it is natural that I would suffer. It's a different way to think about suffering. We're going to find out that in the Roman Catholic tradition, abortion is strongly prohibited, even seen as a grave sin or seen as a horrific embarrassment to a family. So if you're trying to have that conversation and if you're having great resistance, you'll notice it's because of their strong Catholic identity. The family is very valued in this tradition. Also, we're going to find out that if an infant, a Catholic infant, is born and is very sick, it is really important for the family, for the child to be baptized. Now, unlike last rites, baptism doesn't have to be done by a priest. It can be done by any person, because Roman Catholics believe that baptism will remove the child's sin and prepare them for the gift of eternal life. So if a child is gravely ill and hasn't been baptized, it's really important for the family or for the patient to be baptized. And for Catholics, the baptism doesn't have to be all the way under the water. A sprinkling will do, although within Roman Catholicism, the choice is the patient's. Also, we're going to find out inside of Roman Catholicism that natural family planning is really important. It is very valued. So many Catholics will shy away from any type of scientific or artificial birth control. It's probably not a conversation that many Catholics are very comfortable having or explaining, because inside their tradition, natural family planning is really critical and important. Also for Roman Catholics, they in their hospital room may want to have candles or holy images, particularly a rosary. You'll find many of your Catholic patients using their rosary. That's a string of beads that has a cross in the middle of it, and they will use that to pray. Roman Catholics. The second largest Christian tradition is something called Orthodox Christianity. Now, other people may say it's Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox or even Ethiopian Orthodox. There's also Syrian Orthodox. This tradition inside of Christianity is oftentimes known through what we call icons, these images. You see this on the PowerPoint here, this image of Jesus and this great drawing. For Orthodox believers, icons and saints become really, really important. Now, this is the second largest branch of Christianity, and in that, for both Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians, Mary, Jesus' mother, is really important. So if you go into an Orthodox church, you may see very large pictures of Mary. You may see statues of Mary, just like you would in the Roman Catholic Church. And that's because Jesus and his mother are highly valued. They see Mary as the God-bearer into our world. Just like in Roman Catholicism, Orthodox believers are going to have a strong value to Eucharist or communion. And again, just like in the Roman Catholic tradition, both Catholics and Orthodox believe that communion can only be presided over or officiated by a priest, a male priest. A regular person cannot say the prayers over the sacrament and or consecrate the elements. These are for the priests alone. Because in the Roman Catholic tradition and in the Orthodox tradition, they believe that that wine and that bread, it's not simply wine and bread. When the prayers are said, that those elements of wine and bread are what we call transubstantiation, the miracle of Jesus' body and blood. The bread becomes Jesus' body. The wine becomes Jesus' blood, not in a symbolic way or a metaphysical way or a metaphorical way, but in an actual literal way. It's very important for Roman Catholics and Orthodox believers to receive the Eucharist, to receive communion, because they believe that is Jesus' body and blood. Also, you're going to notice here in our PowerPoint that Orthodox believers have a different shaped cross. Rather than the kind of the traditional cross with a T, they have a third part of it. And you'll notice that's what we call an Orthodox cross. So you may see that on your patients' jewelry or icons. Also, it's important in the Orthodox tradition for babies to be baptized at 2 months old. But remember how I told you inside of Roman Catholicism that a baby can be sprinkled? Not inside the Orthodox tradition. A child is fully immersed in a great, glorious way. That could be startling if you're not a part of that tradition, but it's very comforting for a family. Also, for both Catholics and Orthodox, when they pray, they're going to pray using the sign of the cross. So you'll see them do something like this. And for Orthodox believers, they're going to make the sign of the cross in threefold pattern, right? So that may be, if you've never seen that before, that's a sign of a person valuing and leaning into their Orthodox tradition. Again, be mindful that for your Orthodox patients or students, icons and images will become very important. So you walk in, you may see right beside their hospital bed an icon that they very much value. Now let's talk about the fastest growing expression of Christianity in the world, Pentecostal Christianity. When I told you about Roman Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity as these what we call very liturgical or very formal expressions of the Christian faith with a high sense of hierarchy and great historic traditions, Pentecostal Christianity is different than that. It's much more free than that. And when your Pentecostal Christian student or patient comes in, you may not know, you may not see anything about them that would make them any different. But let's talk about what makes some distinctives within inside of Pentecostal Christianity. The first thing is this: they have a great value on the Holy Spirit, or they might call it the Holy Ghost. And what that means is that God's Spirit lives inside of them and fills them up and gives them words of knowledge, gives them confidence, gives them power, but especially it gives them faith. So you may find that a person is praying, and when the Pentecostal Christian prays, they're going to pray in what's known as tongues. It's a language that you and I don't know. And for many people, when they hear tongues, it kind of sounds like gibberish in some ways. But this, for Pentecostal Christians, is the belief that God is communicating to them. God's Spirit is crying out in a spiritual language, or the language of the angels, that is communicating back to God. And this is a glorious, euphoric, spiritual experience. So if you are about to care for your patient, and a Pentecostal Christian is praying with their pastor or praying with their church community right before maybe a surgery, you might hear this go on. You might hear speaking in tongues and wonder what's going on. A reminder, that's the belief that God's Spirit is crying out inside of them and praying to God in this heavenly language. Pentecostal Christians believe that God has the power to heal right now in the most dramatic, miraculous ways. So when you're having a conversation with your patient and you may say, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Musick, but it really looks like there's cancer there and this cancer is pretty aggressive. A Pentecostal Christian may stop you and say, whoa, don't say that to me. I am not going to receive that. You may be stunned and like, I don't know what you mean. Inside of Pentecostal Christianity, there is this idea that what you name can happen in this world. So you'll see people who will name and claim things such as, my body will be healed in Jesus' name. I will walk again. My child will be free from cancer. You may see Pentecostal Christians, they will write scripture verses on pieces of paper and put around their hospital bed. They may have little cloths that are anointed with a little oil that they will keep with them, holding in their hands or putting under their pillows, because it's this belief that the dramatic power of God to heal them completely, and many times even without any kind of medical intervention. So you might want to have a conversation about chemotherapy, and they will say, my God is a healer. My God will provide. Also, you're going to find out that Pentecostal Christians will use the anointing of oil, literally oil, to put on their foreheads or on their hands or their place where their injury is, and people will gather around them, putting their hands on them and praying for them in Jesus' name. This is a way for Pentecostal Christians to express their desire for healing. Again, this is the fastest growing religious tradition in the world. So many of your patients or students may come from this tradition. Now, we've talked about the three largest expressions of Christianity: Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox tradition, and Pentecostal Christianity. Now we're going to get a little smaller, and let's talk about the Amish tradition. Unlike your Pentecostals who may walk in and you would not know anything about their religious identity, about what they would be wearing, your Amish Christians will be very identifiable. Amish Christians are Christians who believe in the simplicity of what we call plain speaking and plain clothing. So typically we'll only wear one solid color, blue or black. Won't even have zippers, right? Amish Christians shy away from most technology. Not going to have cell phones, not going to have cars. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be brought to the hospital by a car, but they won't drive it. So if you've ever seen the image of a horse or a buggy, this is oftentimes coming from the Amish community. The Amish community even uses a different language. They use what's called Pennsylvania Dutch. And also, they are a very closed community. I don't mean that in a negative way, but the Amish community stays inside the Amish community. They do not value higher education, and Amish students are not allowed to pursue education beyond the 8th grade. Again, shying away from technology, and in the United States, Amish Christians are exempt from paying any form of Social Security, so most likely will not have any kind of health care coverage. It's really important to realize Amish Christians will not practice any kind of scientific or artificial birth control. So probably you don't want to have a conversation about that. And oftentimes, Amish Christians will also shy away from vaccines or other types of interventions of those nature. Strong family system inside the Amish community. Now granted, everybody is different, but inside of this community it's really important to recognize that when an Amish person comes to the hospital or comes to your healthcare setting, in many ways, or almost always, that is going to feel like a foreign country. It is going to feel like a brand new land for them, of all the technology, the different ways that people are wearing clothes. So be mindful of that. It's really important for an Amish Christian to have other Amish persons, particularly their family, around them when you're serving them. As we continue on and we think about various branches of Christianity, let's talk about the Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh-day Adventists, in many ways, are like any other Christian that you may encounter, but they have a few distinctives that's important to point out. For Seventh-day Adventists, they have a deep reverence and value and honor to what is known as the Sabbath. And what I mean when I say Sabbath is I mean the literal Friday night when the sun goes down till Saturday night when the sun goes down. That is their holy day where they will not work. It's important for Seventh-day Adventists on that day to grow in family appreciation, to worship, to study, but to not work. Hence why they're called Seventh-day Adventists. And in this, Seventh-day Adventists also feel a strong compulsion to warn other people about Jesus' near return. So as they're honoring Sabbath, they also may want to tell you about the fact that they believe that Jesus is about to return. Also, Seventh-day Adventists believe that they take the Bible's dietary laws very serious, and many times literally. So a lot of Seventh-day Adventists will be vegetarians and have a strict dietary practice. It's also important, remember how we talked about earlier where many Christians, like your Roman Catholics or your Orthodox believers, when you're having a terminal conversation with them, that they might have extreme comfort in going off to heaven to be with relatives or grandparents, to going off to see the face of God. For Seventh-day Adventists, they believe that death is a period of unconsciousness. So there won't be any going off to see grandma or grandpa. There is simply a period of unconsciousness in waiting that near return of Jesus. So for Seventh-day Adventists, it's important to honor their holy day of the Sabbath. Now, as we think about the broad umbrella of Christianity, let's look at a few other traditions that see themselves inside of the Christian tradition. And the first one is the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. Now, some people may say, I've never heard of that. You might have heard of a very popular term used for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the term is Mormons. And you say, I've heard that term. Well, it turns out now the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints no longer uses the term Mormon, but they will use it when it comes to their most holy book, the Book of Mormon. So let's talk a little bit more about the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. They are very family-oriented, and it goes along with their own theology, the belief that marriages done inside of a temple are eternal, that God is the Father, and that for members of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, they see their family as the family that they will have in all of eternity. So you'll see a really family-focused religious tradition. Also, we're going to find out in this religious tradition that there is no use of alcohol or tobacco or coffee. All these things are really highly discouraged. They're strongly encouraged to fast once a month, and also they use a particular version of the Bible called the King James Version. and they hold and revere the Bible like any other Christian would. They also have the Book of Mormon that you may see. It's a small little blue book that oftentimes you will see. And of course, one of the more distinctive things about the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints is what they call mission. Young people inside this tradition between 18 and 25 will go on mission. That's where you may see the white shirts and the black ties for the men with the name tags, or the women who go out, and they go around the world sharing their faith and a spiritual focus between 18 months and 2 years. The Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints is predominantly experienced in Western states, particularly the state of Utah, with Salt Lake City being their spiritual capital. Another tradition that oftentimes can be confused for the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints is what we call Jehovah's Witnesses. Again, just as the person with a white shirt and a black tie and the name tag may knock on your door to share a little bit about their faith, you may also have a pair of people who come up and on a Saturday knock on your door bringing some religious literature. Don't confuse them with the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. It's your friends from the local Kingdom Hall. It's the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses inside this tradition have this strong sense of Jesus' return. They see themselves inside of Christianity, but they believe that the world, the end of the world, is very, very near. Hence why it's their spiritual and moral obligation to go out and to share the message of their religious expression, their religious truth. Now, what's important about Jehovah's Witnesses is a few things. Number one, that they want to share their faith. So if you're serving a Jehovah's Witness patient, it's most likely they're going to share their faith with you. And also, it's very likely that they will give you some of their religious literature. And you will see their literature many different places, from hospital waiting rooms to your doctor's office waiting room. It's called the Watchtower, which you see right here in the PowerPoint. The Watchtower is a publication of the Jehovah's Witness tradition. Now, inside of this tradition, there is no celebrating of holidays. So they're not going to give you gifts, nor are they going to celebrate their birthdays, which may feel a little different for you, but that's very much a part of their tradition. So there won't be a Christmas celebration or an Easter celebration. But also, Jehovah's Witnesses do not have the same experience or reverence for the American flag like many other American citizens. Jehovah's Witnesses will not participate in the pledge or the national anthem, but also they will not participate in military service. For Jehovah's Witnesses, they also believe that death is a place of unconsciousness. Kind of like, remember I told you earlier about the Seventh-day Adventists? Jehovah's Witnesses come from that same tradition. And also, the most important thing about Jehovah's Witnesses for a medical care provider is this, and you maybe have heard of this already. Jehovah's Witnesses do not take blood transfusions because they believe that blood is the gift from God. They will not receive somebody else's blood. This is a very important and fundamental conversation to have with your witness patient before you ever think about blood transfusion. We move on now to Christian Science. And as you may see with the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints or Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Science is a smaller group inside of Christianity, and it has a unique way that it deals with medicine. And unlike any of the other traditions that we've talked about so far, Christian Science may pose the most interesting conversations that you may have with your patients. But again, a couple things that we've already been picking up when we think about Christianity. For Roman Catholics, the importance of last rites. For Orthodox, the importance of, having icons around them. For the Amish, it's this value and appreciation of their families. For Seventh-day Adventists, it's the importance of the Sabbath. For Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints members, it's the role of their family. And for Jehovah's Witnesses, it's the deep value of not having blood transfusions and having a very important conversation with their medical providers. If you have a Jehovah's Witness patient, I want to remind you, have the conversation about blood with them before you, in your first conversations as a healthcare provider. So now we think about Christian Science. Christian Science was founder is Mary Baker Eddy, and she believed that sickness was actually an illusion that prayer could only correct. So you're not really sick, you simply believe in the myth of your sickness, and that can become overcome by prayer. She believed that spiritual powers can cure disease, and as you draw closer to God, you will find health. Christian scientists are not going to donate their organs, and oftentimes are opposed to pretty much any type of medical intervention, because for many, medical intervention seems like a lack of faith or a lack of spiritual power. It's very important for a Christian Scientist that you will be very careful about doing any kind of medical procedures, even in an emergency setting, without first having a conversation or a talk with their family. You want to make sure that we're not violating their individual or personal religious beliefs. The key to Christian Science is the text that Mary Baker Eddy produced, known as Science and Health with the Key to the Scriptures. It's important to realize, too, that children and adults inside this tradition may not be vaccinated. And if a Christian Scientist comes to you as a healthcare provider, they're probably most likely coming really late into their health journey or disease progression, because they're going to prefer not to use doctors. They're going to prefer not to use medicines or immunizations or vaccines, particularly not even wanting to use medicines or pain medicines during birth. So this is something to be mindful of Christian Science. So I've given you a very broad overview of some of the distinctives inside of Christianity. Well, let's continue on now, and let's think about the world's oldest tradition. The world's oldest religious tradition is something known as Hinduism, and you will know of Hinduism preeminently through the subcontinent of India. Hinduism is as diverse as any religious expression on earth. So I just want to put out a caution. It's naive of me to think that we're going to give you the fullest understanding of Hinduism in these few minutes, but we'll give it our best shot. What I mean when I say Hinduism is a religion or a way of life that includes over 1 billion people. And Hinduism is as much cultural as it is religious. Here's how this plays out. Pain and suffering oftentimes are seen as a result of prior actions. So maybe if my child is born with some kind of health condition, we're going to see that as a responsibility or the results of a previous life and a previous action that my child did in their previous life. Hindus are going to believe, or people inside of Hinduism are going to believe in reincarnation and the law of karma. Now, where does this become important? For people inside of Hinduism, cremation is a fundamental death ritual. Now, for children 2 years and under, they may not be cremated, but adults are absolutely going to be cremated. And for many people, the returning of their ashes to the Ganges River in India becomes a sacred religious tradition. Not for all, but for a lot. Hindus have this great value in the sacredness of all things. Rather than having a God that is simply out there, Hindus believe that God is present in everything, from the tree to the animal to your next door neighbor to yourself. And because of that, most Hindus are going to be vegetarian. If they're not vegetarian, they're absolutely going to avoid pork and beef for sure. For Hindus, the bathing of the body, personal hygiene becomes really important. It's a daily practice. And for many people, they will bathe and say their prayers. So when your Hindu patient is in the hospital room, it's really important that they get a daily bath or a sponge bath and do as much as they can for themselves, and to do it early, because for some, they will not eat until they've bathed and said their prayers. So try to make sure that you ask questions about their personal hygiene in relationship to the spirituality, so that they're not waiting all day to eat. Unlike Roman Catholicism and Christianity or Orthodox traditions, where the church is so important, for Hindu believers, there really isn't a church-based structure. It's an individual prayer experience where families or persons may have their own altar at home, or they may occasionally go to temple, but it's not like it is in some Christian traditions where you have to go to a church. Inside of Hinduism, personal piety, personal prayers are what matter the most. So you'll see people praying, meditating, chanting scriptures. Also, you're going to find out that the respect for the elderly is very great inside of Hinduism. Now, unlike later when we talk about Judaism and how circumcision is a right for a Jewish male child, circumcision is nearly unheard of in many Hindu traditions. Yet, when a child is born, the family will pay very, very close attention to when a child is born. There are what we call auspicious times, or unauspicious times for children to be born. So for Hindus, there is a great, strong belief and reliance on the zodiac signs, on astrology. And remember how I told you back in the beginning of our talk today where my daughter was born in India? Well, she was born on a Friday at 7 o'clock in the morning. And our nurses, one of the first things they shared with us was this was a good sign. This was an auspicious sign for a child to be born in early October on a Friday in the morning. So we were greatly rejoiced in this great sharing of their own religious tradition with us. So as we talked about inside of Hinduism, which is so tied in many ways to the country of India, and it is as much religious as cultural, we now are going to step into the second largest religious expression on earth, and that is Islam. Or people who are inside this tradition, they will call themselves Muslims. It means they are people who submit. Now let's talk about Islam for a minute. Islam, inside this tradition, they have the great surrender and value, honor, and worship of one God, Allah. Allah is the mighty, gracious, benevolent, compassionate one. And for Muslims, Allah is the one that they worship, but Allah has used a series of prophets throughout time. And for some, prophets will sound pretty familiar. The prophet Abraham, the prophet Noah, the prophet Moses, the prophet Jonah, even the prophet Jesus or Isa in this tradition. Yet, for Muslims, they believe that the great prophet of all is the prophet Muhammad. And the prophet Muhammad is Allah's instrument of showing us what it means to live a life that is fully submitted to Allah. Inside of Islam, there is a holy book. It's not the Bible. The holy book is the Quran. And this divinely inspired, given book that is given to Muslims in Arabic. So even if a Muslim cannot fully understand Arabic or read Arabic, the reciting of the Quran in Arabic has deep and beautiful spiritual value. So for a Muslim patient, the hearing of the Quran read or sung or chanted in Arabic will have great important value for them. And again, I want to highlight the fact the idea of submission to Allah is the core part of Islam. Now, there are some distinctive practices that are important to recognize. Number one, Muslims are required to pray 5 times a day, from the earliest of the morning until the evening. And in their prayers, they will fully be on the ground, kneeling face down into the ground in a sign of complete submission and adoration of Allah. They are praying towards the east, towards the holy city of Mecca. And in this, Muslims are required to do pilgrimage once a year to Mecca. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, but it's a part of their spiritual life to go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia once in their life. Now, for Muslims, they have a month of fasting. It's really important as a healthcare provider to honor. During the month of Ramadan, Muslims will not eat or drink during the daylight hours. So as soon as the sun rises, they will begin their fasting from food, from water or any kind of drink, and from sexual activity. Until the evening, when the sun is fully down, they will break their fast, usually in community. And this is for 30 days. So Muslims will ask for you to honor their Ramadan fast. Now, of course, there are exceptions for those who are critically ill or pregnant during this time. Now, when it comes to death rituals inside of Islam, autopsies are highly frowned upon. Unless it needs to be done for legal reasons, autopsies are not usually appreciated or valued. Also, prayers are led by a Muslim leader, and it's really important for Muslims to be buried as soon as possible inside this tradition. Let's talk about some distinctive practices that you may encounter with your Muslim patients. No pork or shellfish or alcohol. All of these are prohibited. And also, it's really important as a provider, as a male provider, that I would never offer to shake hands with a female inside of the tradition of Islam or a female Muslim. It is really important that the gender differences are honored and valued and respected. Men can shake hands with men, women can shake hands with women, but it's important not to cross the genders. Also, really critically, as a healthcare provider, as a male, it is important that I only have male Muslim patients. I would not see a female Muslim patient. Female Muslim patients want to have female medical providers, and at all points seek to honor that as much as you can. We're going to find out, though, that inside this tradition there is a great value of doctors and medical providers, because inside of Islam they will see doctors and healthcare workers and nurses as God's instruments, God's agents of being God's helpers to do God's will. And also inside this tradition, Fridays are an important day. Now, not in the same way that maybe a Seventh-day Adventist will hold on to their Sabbath day, yet Friday is a day where many people will go to mosque and say communal prayers. It is not a requirement, but it's a path of continuing to strengthen your personal submission to Allah. Also, when it comes to dietary practices, remember how I said that there is a prohibition against pork or shellfish or alcohol? Halal meat, a type of butchering ritual, will become important for many Muslims to make sure that halal approved meat is eaten. Of course, Muslims will pray 5 times a day facing towards Mecca, but before they pray, you'll notice that Muslims will wash their hands and their feet and their face as they go into the presence of Allah with a purity. This will be important in the hospital setting to provide a way for Muslims to be able to wash themselves before they pray. Now, unlike your Orthodox patients, remember how I said Orthodox Christians may have pictures of icons around their bed? Muslims do not have images. There are no images allowed of Allah, and any kind of image or drawing of the Prophet Muhammad is highly, deeply disrespectful and inappropriate. And finally, another thing that is, in many ways, culturally inside of Islam is how women dress. For some women inside the tradition, they will wear a burqa covering their hair, or they may wear a hijab that will cover almost all of their face. Just their eyes are left open, maybe even covering their hands with gloves, having a full body, loosely flowing outfit. These practices are not absolute requirements inside of Islam. It really depends on which tradition, but a lot of times it depends on where a Muslim is coming from, what part of the world, which country they're coming from, and on the spectrum inside of practicing of their own religious tradition, how serious they take clothing. So just because a person, a Muslim woman, comes into your office and she's not wearing a burqa or hijab, don't assume that she's not a Muslim, and don't assume that she's not practicing her religion in the most appropriate ways. Again, that is a conversation to have with your student or your patient. Now, inside of Islam, I'm not going to go into as much depth as I did with Christianity, but I want to point out two major branches inside of Islam. And the first branch is the Shia part of Islam. About 15% of Muslims are a part of this tradition, and this is a lot of Muslims who come from Iran or Iraq. Now, the difference is this. In the Shia tradition, they only pray 3 times a day. And the major distinction, if you're wondering what's the difference between a Sunni Muslim and a Shia Muslim, it really is this, depending on who will follow the Prophet Muhammad. Inside of the Shia tradition, they believe that the follower, the leaders of the movement, should be the direct bloodline descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Sunni Muslims, on the other hand, which are the overwhelming majority of Muslims around the world. So about 85% of Muslims are actually Sunni Muslims. They believe that the leaders of Islam should be people who are elected. Elected leaders are really important as opposed to bloodline descendants. So this gives you a little window into the second largest religious tradition known as Islam. Let's talk about Judaism. Judaism is one of the oldest religious traditions in the world. And Judaism, very much like Hinduism, can be as much religious as it is cultural. So some people may be Jewish by birthline and by culture, but maybe really aren't practicing what you might think as religious practices. But inside of Judaism, there's this strong adherence to God's commands, decrees, ordinances, and laws, and that God's laws should have dominance or preeminence over a person's preference. So maybe let's say I am a Jewish person and I think, man, I really would like to have a pork sandwich. It's not my personal preference that matters, it's what God has said. And according to God's law, pork is an unclean food. It's not kosher, so therefore I put my personal desires away to honor God's laws, God's commands. Also inside of Judaism, you're going to see this high honor of life. So even if I have to violate one of the other laws that we've talked about, to save life is most important. Now, just like in Christianity, where you may have Pentecostal Christians or Roman Catholics, or inside of Islam, you might have Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims. Inside of Judaism, there are 3 larger distinctive branches inside of Judaism. The first one is Orthodox Judaism, and Orthodox Judaism is probably what you think of when I say the word Jewish. You think of maybe the black hats, the distinctive clothing. Orthodox Jews have a very strict interpretation of what's known as the sacred text, known as the Torah, or the teachings. They believe that the Torah is given by God. You can't change it, and you have to follow all of the Jewish laws, and you follow them in literal fashion. Conservative Jews, on the other hand, may have a little bit more of a modern religious following. And And then finally, your Reform Jewish expression. Reform Jewish expression is going to feel very different than Orthodox tradition, because Reform tradition may hold to some rules, they may not. They have a lot more freedom to interpret the Torah than inside the Orthodox tradition. Now, a few things that will make Judaism very distinctive. Number one, it's the idea of the Sabbath. Just as we talked about inside of Seventh-day Adventism, the idea of Sabbath inside of Judaism is Friday night to Saturday night. And this is a holy day where no work should be done. Even some places, some forms of Judaism won't even have electricity on those days. So you will also, there's one day of required fasting called the Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, where Jews will fast on that day. But dietary restrictions become important. For many Jews, they keep what's called a kosher diet, excluding things like we've talked about before, pork, shellfish, these types of items. Also, we're going to find out inside of Judaism that inside of Orthodox Judaism, there's a requirement to pray at least 3 times a day. And just like in Islam, inside the Jewish tradition, they want to be buried as quick as possible. Cremation is highly discouraged. There's a great value and reverence to the body, even to the place that there's a requirement of saving amputated limbs. Let's talk about Sikhism. Sikhism is a distinctive religion inside of the subcontinent of India. Remember how I told you inside of India that the overwhelming majority of people in India are inside of the Hindu tradition? India is also beautiful in many ways because it's the 3rd largest Muslim country on earth, and it's also the birthplace of Buddhism and the religion we're going to talk about now, Sikhism. Sikhism is often identified as a male who is wearing a turban, just like you see on our picture here. If you see someone wearing a turban, most likely they're going to be a Sikh. Now, inside of Sikhism, there's a belief that all people are equal, that there is one God. God is the supreme guru or the supreme guide, and life really is about selfless work and service and worship. There's also the belief of reincarnation, yet practically for many Sikhs, they may not cut their hair. So under the turban, may have this long, beautiful hair. At death, Sikhs' bodies, they are bathed and dressed and then cremated. Sikhism has a real high regard for a series of gurus, and the founding guru, Guru Nanak, and this really comes from the Punjab region of India. Now, at birth, some distinctives may happen. Inside of a Sikh family at birth, a family member may give a newborn child a drop of honey to help the child's character develop later in life. But of course, there are some other sacred or cultural items that many Sikhs will wear. A turban, which we've talked about. They also may wear a cloth around their chest, an iron bracelet, a wooden comb they may hold or carry, and also for some they may even have a decorative sword. A big thing about Sikhism to pay attention to is the importance of facial hair. For Sikh men, facial hair is really important. And also for some Sikh women, facial hair may be a really important value. So to seek to remove that for surgery will become an important conversation to have with your Sikh patients. Let's talk about Baha'i. Baha'i is a growing religion that feels in some ways kind of like Sikhism, with their appreciation and their value of the oneness of all religions, the oneness and unity of all people. Baha'i believe that we should get rid of all of our prejudices and that it's our individual responsibilities to search out truth. With that, because God is one, people search out the truth and to find that oneness. So inside of Baha'i, you'll find a great value of both religion and science. Inside the tradition also, almost the entire month of March, from March 2nd to March 20th, is a spiritual holiday where they will fast during the daylight time. So from sunrise to sunset, for those 18 days, members of the Baha'i tradition will fast. It feels somewhat like inside of Islam, the holy month of Ramadan, or inside of Christianity, some people may practice a fasting period during what is known as Lent, a 40-day period. So for Baha'i members, eating is important because eating is for health. So they're going to shy away lots of times from alcohol or drugs. They have daily prayers, and they believe that prayer assists them on healing. They try to have a balance in life, and they believe absolutely that the body should be buried. They don't really want embalming, and they definitely do not want cremation. As we're closing up here, let's talk about a couple of native traditions. First one, and I just want to put a caution on any time we talk about indigenous religious expressions or native traditions, these are very variant depending on tribe, historical connection, or even historical traditional connection. I'm going to give you some really broad scope of view real quick inside of the North American, Native American tradition. Again, there is a strong sense of Mother Earth and the sacredness of all beings, or the interconnection of all beings. History and tradition all comes from storytelling. So if you had a native patient and you said, hey, do you have anything I could read that would help me out to understand your tradition? And the answer is probably going to be no, because it's done through oral storytelling and the connection of the elders to the surrounding community. So for your native patient, they will use the term God or Creator interchangeably. But prayer becomes important, and also sacred objects. Could be the use of a pipe or a feather or a turtle shell. Native persons will use these objects as they pray. And it's their tradition, their spirituality is very nature-based, where they will possibly see visions, connecting with animals. There are no written scriptures, and a person who is not native or a person who is not one of the elders should never touch any of the sacred objects. So if a native person is in the hospital and they have some prayer item there and around their hospital bed, please ask permission before you touch or remove anything. Now, when it comes to death, what does death rituals look like inside of Native American tradition? The body is prepared by the family. It's important when death happens to ask the family if they want to lead or prepare the body for death. Also, prayers a lot of times are accompanied by the burning of sage or tobacco, the incense. Women during sacred rituals or sacred times, if they're on their menstruation period, will not be a part of it, will not touch any of the items. And of course, as maybe some people have thought about, the kind of the medicine man or the spiritual elder will become a leader or a wise guide on an individual native person's religious and spiritual journey. Now, a little different expression is Wicca. Wicca is a growing religious tradition or a spiritual tradition inside the United States and is known through the five-pointed star that some people may know as a pentagram. Wicca is a earth-based spirituality, or kind of a neo or new paganism in many ways. And for Wiccan persons, they don't shy away from the pagan title. It's something that they embrace. They have a real concern for the earth and earth justice and for nature. It's really important. They're going to talk about Mother Nature, but also they may have a host of gods or goddesses that they embrace. And ritual is important for a Wicca person, and rituals are, even in pregnancy, there may be a ritual that they do for each of the trimesters, a ritual of naming the child. The full moon becomes an important moment for persons inside this tradition because they believe that when the full moon comes, there's greater magical or spiritual powers available to persons. And you'll see sacred objects that are held valuable, such as crystals or stones, candles, a chalice. And for those who are inside the Wicca tradition, they may have a prayer circle or a worship circle. They may even use the word coven as a part of it. But for a lot of times, people inside of this tradition may be mistrustful of modern medicine. So as you have a conversation, building trust is going to be really important. Scientology. Scientology is something that you may have heard of because some famous people in Hollywood are a part of the Scientology tradition. This is founded by L. Ron Hubbard, and it's the belief and practices based on rigorous research. The doctrines, in many ways, kind of feel like they are run along parallel with scientific laws. Practitioners, or people inside of this tradition, are encouraged to verify the truth on their own personal encounter or personal experiences. What people are seeking inside this tradition is they want a society that is free from any kind of criminality or insanity, any kind of war. They want a world that prospers and is deeply honest. But they also believe in rebirth. Let's talk about a specific religion or religious practice that will oftentimes you'll see with people maybe who might be connected to Haiti or the Caribbean, and this is voodoo. You may have seen this culturally, maybe in the media, but voodoo oftentimes will use a secret language where a voodoo priest inside of their voodoo rituals may have spirit-possessed dancing, a special diet by the priest to gain spiritual powers. Voodoo has this sense that those who have died and gone on are actually much closer to us than we realize. There's a great adherence to the ancestors and the spiritual power that they may bring. And that inside of voodoo practice or inside of voodoo ritual, the chanting and the singing and the celebrating will call forth these ancestors to gather with them. Voodoo, they do have one God, but they also have other spiritual beings, and these spiritual beings really control so much of what happens. And that's why what is known so popularly in mass media about kind of like a voodoo doll or inside of these voodoo curse, it's really these other spiritual entities that are doing the bidding of those who are powerful inside of voodooism. I gave you an image here, you'll see on your PowerPoint, of a traditional voodoo altar. And you'll see, which is really important to see here, you'll see the polling of a lot of different religious traditions. In the center there, you see the Virgin Mary from Roman Catholicism being held into there. So voodoo can feel, in many ways, kind of a combination of some traditions. It's important to realize as a healthcare provider for people inside of this tradition that medicine, maybe herbal remedies or objects could be used. But also inside of the voodoo practice, the religious practice of voodooism, that there is this idea of animal sacrifice that is oftentimes used. Drums and dancing become really important. And ceremonies are very secret. And I think probably a lot of that has to do with so much of the hype and sensationalism done in media, that people want to keep this more private and personal to themselves. And for many people, this is going to be something that they're going to be mistrusting of modern medicine. Rastafarians. Rastafarians, you probably have heard of this tradition, maybe through the great artist Bob Marley. Rastafarians is a religious social movement preeminently coming from Jamaica. They do have one God, and this one God, Jah, lives inside of each of us. Inside of Rastafarianism is this longing and desire to return back to Africa. It is the veneration of African culture. But also, what may be most important for a healthcare provider, a Rastafarian is going to have a strong adherence and use of marijuana. Now, interestingly enough, there is a strong prohibition against alcohol. But Rastafarians strongly believe that marijuana has spiritual, physical, and personal benefits. Rastafarians may not be comfortable talking about death because they believe life is eternal and they see their body as holy. So maybe as a healthcare provider, you might think, wow, like they're using marijuana, I wonder what they think of their body. Well, it turns out Rastafarians have a very high view of their body, oftentimes wanting to put only natural things in there. Hence their strong adherence to marijuana as a natural herb grown on the earth. Also, you're going to see for many Rastafarians a resistance to any kind of pork or shellfish or alcohol or tobacco, but also you're going to see that many Rastafarians will have dreadlocks. That'll be kind of a common part of that. Let's talk about two more religious traditions, and one of the last is Hawaiian native spirituality, oftentimes coming from people who are native to the Hawaiian Islands, and they have what's called the aloha spirit, the idea of this inner connection with all things. Even those who have physically departed this physical earth, they are deeply connected to their ancestors, because turns out death isn't like traditionally thought. Death is simply changing an address. We're still very much connected to all of those who have died. Inside of this tradition, there are family guardians that will help each family, and funerals can't be attended by pregnant women. When our lives become disrupted and bad things start happening, oftentimes it's because we've got in a broken relationship with nature. This is a very nature-based religious tradition. In individuals, you're responsible to become healthy on your own. Medications can be helpful and useful, but as long as it doesn't affect the mind. And also with this, prayer and fasting can become important, but inside of this tradition, there's a real value of silence, finding physical healing as you get right in one with the universe. Now, interestingly enough, baby names could be delayed until the mother has a dream or receives a vision or has some kind of spiritual connection about what is most important to her. Of course, cleansing, as a person is going to get ready for their religious practice, they may take on cleansing for multiple days to be spiritually ready for the practice. Now, just like Native American traditions, there are no written scriptures. You're not going to find books with their holy text because it's passed down through story. And ultimately, within the Hawaiian tradition, native traditional clothing will be really, really important. So in our last couple traditions we've talked about, Rastafarianism, within Voodooism, Native American traditions, and Hawaiian spirituality, oftentimes particular clothing will become part of it. So today, I want to thank you. Thanks for leaning in. Thanks for diving in to navigating this journey of religious diversity. And again, my name is Rob Musick, chaplain with the University of Pikeville. If there are any ways that I can help you, let me know. Thanks again. Have a great day.